So in part 1 I explained how to paint this table starting from the top through the sides and down the legs. So today, part 2, you can see over here that I've already done half of the table. I've distressed it, and then I'll do a little bit of the tabletop. I'll show you how to do the scalloping and the legs, and then I'll show you the finished product. I'll also show you how to wax using a clear paste wax. And also, if you want to use a dark antique wax, I'm going to put a little bit on the scalloped edges so you can see how to do that too. Before we start, I just want to show you what types of sandpaper we're going to be using. So this is 150 grit. It's a moderate grit sandpaper. And then 100 grit is a little more coarse than the 150. It's not quite as coarse as a 60 or an 80. I don't want to use something too coarse because my tabletop and the scalloping and the legs will get too distressed. I'm going more for an old look, not something overly antique and distressed. I want it just enough where it looks old, but not too distressed where, quite frankly, it looks like it's from the 1800s and needs another paint job. So that's that. I already have some sandpaper made up, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the 150 grit sandpaper to give my edges a nice worn look. You can always go back over and give it more of a distressing if you feel that the light pressure that you're applying isn't giving you the look you're going for. Hopefully you can see what's happening here as I sand down the edges. Some of the tabletop is showing through, the natural color of the wood is showing through. One thing I didn't mention before is always have a rag. It could be either slightly damp or dry, but you're going to accumulate quite a bit of dust, so every so often just make sure you wipe your piece down. I like to just go over it with my hand to make sure that I'm not leaving any residue, so when I go back over it with a clean wet cloth afterwards, I don't have clumps of dust collecting, and then the waxing process will actually be a lot easier later. So the next thing I want to do is grab my 100 and move on to the tabletop. Sometimes the tabletop tends to get painted a little heavier because it's a flatter surface, so it's easier to slap on the paint on the tabletop than it is on the edges or on the scalloping. So it might take a lot more pressure to get the look you're going for on the tabletop versus other surfaces. I like to work in random patterns, circular, straight. It takes quite a bit of time to actually get the paint to start moving off. See how it's just slightly starting to move right now? What you'll notice is over the course of using the sandpaper, hopefully you can see this, but it starts getting paint collecting on the sandpaper. You're going to want to switch out because what happens is that collected paint will actually start pulling your paint off of the piece, and you'll get like really long strippy lines. Some people are into that, I'm not. I like more of an overall even distressed look. So you can see I've done this area right here. I'm starting to pick up some distressing, and the wood that was bare yesterday and is white now is starting to show through. And that's what we want. And that's basically as easy as distressing gets. Now that I showed you how to do a bit of the tabletop, we're going to move on to the scalloped edges here. As you can see, there's a lot of different differentiation between the two levels. This level is a bit higher than the sub-level of the detailing. So when I sanded down earlier, some of the bare wood showed through, so you can actually see the scalloped edges pop. And that's the look I'm going to go for on the other side. I was using the 100 grit earlier on the tabletop because it was a thicker surface of paint. I'm going to actually switch back over to the 150 for the scalloped edges. What I was doing earlier was using the 100 just on the very beginning, and it was coming off a little too quick. I want to have more control over that, so I'll switch to my 150, which is right here. It's a little bit of a finer grit sandpaper. It's not as coarse. It won't strip so easily. So honestly, the easiest thing to do on a scallop surface is just lay your sandpaper flat and go back and forth a couple of times. See how that's popping already? I think I went over it 3 times. And then on edges like this, same thing, just flat and kind of move in a circular pattern. You can always take off more later. I'm going to apply a little more pressure to get a darker underlayer coming through, and then around these little circles that I have here, you can see over here I did it. Just kind of take the corner of the sandpaper that you have and go around in a circular pattern right around the circles. And that will help make the detail of those circles pop. Again, I'm keeping the sandpaper flat, not really going in any one pattern, a little bit random. Once you get the look you're going for, you can move on to whatever sub-layer you may have, if you even have a sub-layer underneath the detail that's above. Since there's little peaks, I'm going to use the corner of the sandpaper to kind of get in there. See how it's coming off right here? That's what we're going for. Just keep changing your pressure based on how much paint you want to come off and how much of a distressed feel you want to go for. So now that I showed you how to do the top and I showed you how to do the sides and the scalloping, I'm going to show you how to do the base and the legs. As I said in the beginning of the tutorial for part 2, I more heavily distress the legs than any other part of the table because that would be the area on a table that gets the most wear from people kicking over years and years. So on the legs, I'll use 100 grit sandpaper, and then maybe on the table base, I'll use the 150, so it's a little less coarse, it's a little smoother. So here is my 150. I'm going to get under the table because that's the only way to do this. And literally like we did up here with the scalloping, just put your sandpaper flat right on the surface you want to sand and just move it around. You see how that's coming off? I'm actually going to switch to the 100 because of the angle I'm at. I can't really get the pressure I need, so if you find that you can't get the strength to get the look you're going for, switch to a lower grit, and then you have to apply a little less pressure. See how it's showing the 3 different tiers right there? So the whole point of distressing is to do a random pattern. You don't want it perfectly symmetrical across the board in terms of, you know, if one piece of distressing over here looks the same over there, it kind of looks manufactured. We're going for something more natural and more organic. I'm going to switch back to the lighter, or I should say the smoother sandpaper, not the coarse sandpaper, for this base area. I'm not really sure how the paint's going to come off at first. Like I said earlier, make sure you start smoother and apply less pressure because you can always go back and take more off. It's a lot harder to go and paint the piece over again. You can do it. I've done it before. But why go through that trouble if you can just mitigate taking off too much in the first place? The next part I'm going to show you how to do are the legs. So I'm going to start with the 150. And just go down the edges so you get that nice highlighted look. It almost looks like you're highlighting with a dark color. Do the same underneath. And then you can move on to the flat surfaces. See how quickly this paint's coming off? That's why I'm not using the 100, I'm using the 150 because I don't want too much to come off. I can always go back and take more off. Again, use a random pattern. You don't want it to look manufactured, you want it to look more organic. And it's starting to look how I want it to, maybe just a little bit more. Before I show you how to wax, I want to show you what wax I'm actually using. So this is called Butcher's Bowling Alley Wax. Apparently it's been around since 1880 and it's America's premier wax. I don't know about that. I like to use a couple of different types of waxes. I've used S.C. Johnson paste wax. I've used Annie Sloan paste wax. I like the Fitties & Sons paste wax. It's an English wax, but you can get it here in America. Whatever kind of paste wax you want to use, it's really your choice. It's a matter of what look you're going for. Some of them are clear, some of them are a brown or an antique, and that gives you that darker finish. I've used a lot of antique waxes over a lot of my pieces to give it that aged antique look. What happens with the wax is you put it on, you kind of let it sit for a couple seconds, and then you buff it off. Some waxes are a little different, so make sure that you get a feel for it before you use it all over a piece. This wax goes on and buffs off just like all the other waxes I like to use, so I know that already. What I'm going to be using is a lint-free cloth for application. You can use a brush if you want. You can use a stippling brush, which are the rounded brushes that have the heads. They're like 1 inch to 2 inches depending on what size you get. And I'm actually using a yogurt cup. I've put the wax that I think I'm going to need in the yogurt cup so that I don't have to dip my rag in and out of the wax. It's just something I like to do. So reduce, reuse, recycle. These are great. So now we're getting down to the last bit of this project, and that's to do the waxing. We're going to use a lint-free cloth, as you can see here. You can get them from Home Depot, Lowe's. You can use an old t-shirt. What you want to do is just take your cloth and kind of dip it in the wax. It's kind of hard to see since it's a clear wax, but just start in any section really. And I like to use circular motions. Kind of use a thin film. You don't want to get it too thick at first. Keep going over the surface. You don't have to backtrack really. Don't worry about buffing too much now. Just kind of get it covered. I'll do this one section for a bit. What wax does is it gives it a protective coating so that when you use this surface, you don't continue to actually distress the piece by wear and tear. And the more wax you put on, the more of a protective coating you actually give the piece. Okay, so here I did the first coat of wax. You can probably see it, but it looks a little cleaner because the wax is actually kind of cleaning the piece as I go. You can see that it's getting a little yellow. Now, after it kind of sets for a couple seconds, what you want to do, especially with this paste wax, is give it a nice buffing. Not too hard, but apply a good amount of pressure. And what this does is it removes the excess wax that won't really seep into the paint. And then just keep moving along. You can work in small areas, you can work in bigger areas, depending on the paste wax that you're using. They have different dry times, so as you get more familiar with different types of wax, you'll know how much time between that first initial coat you put on and then having to go back and buff it off, how much time you'll actually have to do that. What you don't want to have happen is to put the wax on and then not remove the excess. That's going to make for a very difficult situation later on, maybe tomorrow if you were to go back to it. It gets really filmy and tacky and it's really hard to get off. So I did the clear coat of paste wax on the entire surface of the top of the table, and I also did the rim. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to do the scalloping. It's really not that hard. It might seem like it because there's a lot of detail. Just get the same amount of wax as you normally would on your rag and just go over it. What might happen because of these little circles here is that wax accumulates in the hole. My suggestion is don't worry about that right now. After you're all done, go back with a Q-tip and kind of just scoop out the extra wax if there is any in there. Try to get into the little crevices as best as possible. Again, Q-tips might be your best friend if you really want to get that detailed. You can get in these little crevices a little better with something smaller. You can also use an artist's brush if that's what you want to do. Okay, so that has the first coat on it. What I normally do is wait a little while and then I go back and buff it off. Okay, next I'll show you how to do the base. So again, get the wax on your rag. The bigger, broader surfaces are always easier to do, especially when you're using a rag. So just get a fair amount of wax on, make sure you get all the surfaces and the detail. The legs are really easy to do. I forgot to mention, I went over this piece with a dry rag and then a very slightly damp rag to make sure that I got all of the dust off. My suggestion is if you can ventilate the area that you should. This paste wax actually doesn't have as much of an odor as the Fitties and Sons that I usually use. Paste wax is a oil-based product. It does not have a very overly pleasant smell. It's a little pungent, strong, petroleum-based. So if you can ventilate the area, you should. Okay, so that's the first coat of wax on this. Just going to go quickly over it and make sure that I got any of the extra. And that's how you do the wax. It is really that easy. If you feel a little uncomfortable with the clear wax, doing it on the piece that you just worked so hard to paint and then sand, my recommendation is to use just a piece of plywood or even some leftover baseboard molding or crown molding that you have. That way you get the detail and to learn how to use the rag and the crevices and to go over it. So this is what I'm going for, the entire piece, the look, the feel, and there's just a couple of more spots that I have to rough up and to sand and to get prepped before I wax all of the scalloping and do the rest of the legs, and then once I'm done I'll show you the finished piece. Here's the final product. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook at Tender Love and Paint or on Twitter, Tender Love Paint. You can also just comment on this video and I will get back to you. You can also shoot me an email at amanda@tenderloveandpaint.com. Thanks guys, thanks for watching, bye!